When a reclusive tech millionaire buys a mountain retreat to escape chaos, a power-hungry HOA decides his land belongs to them. But they picked the wrong man to intimidate, and he's ready to fight back. Thomas Granger had spent most of his adult life building things for other people: systems, companies, fortunes. At 42, after selling his Denver-based tech startup for more money than he'd ever need, he finally decided to build something for himself. Peace. The kind of peace you couldn't buy in the city, where the only traffic came from elk in the morning, and your nearest neighbor was a mile away through dense forest. That's why he purchased an 80-acre slice of untouched wilderness nestled high in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, just past the boundaries of a wealthy planned community called Pine Ridge Mountain. His new home was a sturdy, custom-built lodge with wide timber beams, a stone fireplace large enough to walk into, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a valley where fog drifted like ghosts in the early morning. The property also came with an old hunting cabin deeper in the woods, a 3-car garage he used more for storing equipment than vehicles, and a private well that made the entire setup self-sufficient. Most importantly, Thomas had made absolutely sure that his land was not, in any way, under the jurisdiction of the Pine Ridge Mountain Homeowners Association. He had the surveys, the deeds, and legal verification. His land was sovereign, free. It wasn't just a matter of comfort for Thomas, it was principle. After decades of dealing with investors' contracts and corporate nonsense, he'd grown allergic to bureaucracy, especially the petty kind that dictated the height of your grass or the color of your mailbox. The HOA down the road was known for its tight control and inflated sense of authority, and Thomas had no interest in being part of their suburban fiefdom. His driveway didn't connect to their road network. His property line was a solid legal wall. He wasn't their neighbor. He was their boundary. The first 6 months on the mountain were everything he'd dreamed of. He hiked the woods with his dogs, fixed up the old cabin, and worked remotely on passion projects with the kind of joy he hadn't felt since his 20s. The snow came early, but he didn't mind plowing the long, winding driveway himself. It was part of the solitude. No drones, no mailmen with agendas, no surprise visits, just the wind in the pines and the sound of firewood crackling in the hearth. But peace, he would soon learn, was a fragile thing. It began on a crisp September morning, the kind Thomas usually treasured. The air was cool, sharp with the scent of pine, and the mountains were beginning to tint with the first hints of autumn. He had just finished splitting wood behind the garage when he noticed the low hum of an engine. Strange, considering his driveway was nearly half a mile of gravel and rock winding through the trees. He wasn't expecting anyone. A few minutes later, a silver SUV with Pine Ridge Mountain HOA decals rolled into view, tires crunching across the forest floor like it owned the road. It stopped near his front porch. From the passenger seat stepped a woman in her 50s, tall, severe, her platinum hair styled into a rigid bob that didn't move in the breeze. Her name, he would soon learn, was Karen Lawrence, president of the Pine Ridge HOA. 3 others exited the vehicle behind her, all dressed in matching polos, clipboards in hand. HOA enforcers, Thomas thought dryly. Karen didn't waste time. "Mr. Granger, good morning," she said with a tight-lipped smile that held no warmth. "We've come to inspect the eastern perimeter of your property. There's a fire access route we need to assess." Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans, already tense. "Fire access route? There's no easement through my land. That's private property." Karen's smile remained frozen, but her tone sharpened. "There's a trail that runs from the back of our neighborhood up toward the northern ridge. It crosses the edge of your property, unmarked, but historical. Our records show it's been used as an emergency path for years. We're here to confirm viability." "That trail hasn't been used in decades," Thomas replied, stepping closer. "It's overgrown, and more importantly, it's not yours to inspect. I'm not part of Pine Ridge. I'm not under your HOA. Karen's eyes flicked to her companions, then back to him. With wildfire risks increasing, access routes are a matter of public safety. We're not here to argue ownership, just to do our due diligence. I'm sure you understand. Thomas didn't move. You can do all the diligence you want, on your side of the line. This land is mine. You don't get to wander in here with your clipboards and start measuring things. One of the HOA reps muttered something, clearly annoyed. Karen raised a hand, signaling for patience. Mr. Granger, we're trying to be cooperative. The trail may need to be re-cleared. We're simply requesting temporary access. Thomas's patience ran thinner than the mountain air. Request denied. You're trespassing. Next time, don't drive halfway up a mountain uninvited. Karen's smile faltered. You may regret refusing to work with us. Is that a threat? He asked, voice flat. Just a prediction, she said coolly, before turning back to her team. They piled into the SUV and left without another word, tires spinning gravel as they pulled away. Thomas stood there for a while, heart steady but mind already racing. It wasn't just a visit. It was a warning shot. The following week, the woods no longer felt as private. At first, it was subtle. Small things Thomas noticed during his morning hikes or late-night walks with his dogs. A snapped branch that hadn't been there the day before. Fresh boot prints in the dirt near the cabin, spaced too evenly to be from wildlife. Once, he found a discarded energy bar wrapper tucked behind a tree near the rear property line, exactly where Karen had mentioned the historical trail. Something wasn't right. It escalated when he heard the buzz. High-pitched, persistent, mechanical, a drone. He spotted it hovering just above the tree line, slow and deliberate. Its camera gimbal pointed directly at his house. Thomas stood on the porch and stared at it, unmoving, arms crossed. It paused in the air, as if uncertain, then drifted back over the trees and disappeared. He wasn't surprised when it returned the next morning. Lower, this time, bolder. He grabbed his binoculars and caught sight of its markings. Pine Ridge Security Division. By the third day, it wasn't just drones. He was walking his trail near the southern slope when he spotted two figures crouched behind a fallen log, both wearing dark jackets, each with the HOA's emblem stitched on the back. One held a clipboard, the other a camera with a zoom lens. They didn't see him at first, too focused on whatever they were recording, but when Thomas stepped into view and called out, looking for something, they both flinched like kids caught in the wrong backyard. Just performing a terrain assessment, one of them stammered, already backing up. You're on private property, Thomas said, voice cold. You know that, right? We thought this was part of the community fire zone, the other lied. Thomas pulled his phone from his pocket. You've got 5 seconds to be off my land, or I'm calling the sheriff. They didn't wait for the countdown. He watched them crash awkwardly through the underbrush, clearly unfamiliar with terrain not paved and landscaped. That afternoon, he installed new motion-activated cameras and updated his security system alerts. He also contacted a property attorney in town just in case. The unease crawling up his spine wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Days later, an official envelope appeared in his mailbox, marked with Pine Ridge HOA's seal. Inside was a formal notice stating that, per the 1993 Pine Ridge Mountain Fire Response Map, his property overlapped with a designated emergency zone. Therefore, access must be granted for inspections and route clearance. It also included a veiled threat. Failure to comply may result in legal escalations or public safety interventions. Thomas read it twice, then chuckled darkly. The gall. There was no legal basis for any of it. He drafted a response through his attorney, clearly stating that no such easement existed, and that any further intrusion would be treated as trespassing. He also placed fresh, no trespassing signs along the ridge trail and near the back clearing. Larger now, bolted into trees. But the final straw came when a folded flyer appeared under his windshield wiper during a grocery run. In town. HO. So, special session. Community vote to extend fire safety jurisdiction to adjacent parcels. In fine print below, affected properties encouraged to attend. Refusal to cooperate may be subject to emergency oversight. They weren't just pressuring him now. They were planning something bigger. It happened on a Sunday morning just after dawn. Thomas had returned from a 2-day fishing trip to a sight that made his stomach knot with disbelief. His front gate, an iron structure he'd welded himself, was wide open, one hinge broken clean off. Deep tire tracks, fresh in soft dirt, carved a path through the gravel driveway leading all the way to his main clearing. And in the middle of it all, like some absurd parade, sat a fire truck from the local volunteer station, a Pine Ridge HOA SUV, and 2 sheriff's cruisers with their lights flashing in the low morning fog. Thomas slowed his truck to a crawl, then parked and stepped out slowly, adrenaline surging. His dogs barked furiously inside the house as he surveyed the scene. Several people in HOA jackets were milling around the edge of the woods near his garage, pointing clipboards at trees as if surveying the land. Karen Lawrence stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, exuding smug satisfaction. When she spotted Thomas, her lips curled into a smile of false relief. "There you are," she called out. "We were beginning to worry." Thomas walked straight past her and addressed one of the deputies. "Someone want to tell me why there are emergency vehicles on my property?" The deputy, a younger guy named Sullivan, whom Thomas had met once before in town, shifted uncomfortably. "We got a call from the HOA claiming there was a fire hazard. Blocked access to an emergency route. They said you were refusing to allow them in." Thomas turned to Karen. "You broke into my land. You smashed my gate." Karen didn't flinch. "We tried calling. No response. Given the danger of wildfire season, we had no choice but to invoke emergency authority. The route behind your property is critical." "It's not behind my property," Thomas snapped. "It's on my property. And you have no such authority. There is no easement, no right of way. This is trespassing and criminal damage." Karen's expression hardened. "You left us no alternative. Your obstruction is a threat to the entire community." Thomas turned back to Sullivan. "You want proof? I've got deeds, maps, legal statements, all at the house, and security footage of them forcing the gate." The deputy gave a small nod. "Let's take a look." Inside, Thomas pulled out a binder containing all his legal documents and the surveyor's report, as well as his phone with the camera footage, clear images of HOA members prying open the gate with crowbars and waving the fire crew forward like they were staging a damn parade. By the time the sheriff himself arrived, an older man named Edson with a steady hand and no patience for nonsense, things had shifted. He reviewed the documents, watched the footage, and called the fire crew aside for a private word. Within 15 minutes, the fire truck was rolling back down the driveway. The HOA volunteers shuffled awkwardly into their vehicle. Karen, however, remained. "You've made a mistake, Mr. Granger," she said coldly. "The community won't stand for this kind of isolationism. If you won't participate, we'll make sure someone forces you to." Thomas met her gaze, stone still. "I don't belong to your community, Karen. And the only thing getting forced now is a criminal case." As she climbed into the SUV, Thomas caught her muttering to one of her board members, "This isn't over." And for the first time, he believed her. But she had just crossed a line no apology could erase. The following morning, Thomas was already on the phone with his attorney before the sun had cleared the ridge. His voice was calm, but his words were razor sharp. The footage of the forced entry, the broken gate, the coordinated trespassing under false pretenses. It was all handed over with a methodical precision. His lawyer, Michelle Anders, a sharp-witted property rights specialist from Boulder, didn't need convincing. They didn't just step over a line, she said after reviewing the materials. They bulldozed it, then tried to set up camp. Let's hit back. Hard. Over the next few days, Michelle built a case with surgical efficiency. She subpoenaed drone footage records and GPS logs from HOA security. She filed a Freedom of Information request to get dispatch call details from 911, confirming that Karen had deliberately exaggerated the situation to trigger an emergency response. Even more damning, emails from HOA members, obtained through a former board treasurer willing to talk, revealed they knew Thomas's property wasn't under their jurisdiction, but believed that pressure and emergency optics might force a concession. By week's end, Thomas filed a multi-pronged lawsuit against the Pine Ridge HOA and Karen Lawrence personally. The charges included criminal trespass, destruction of property, harassment, false emergency reporting, and attempted encroachment on private land. The suit also demanded punitive damages, legal fees, and a permanent restraining order, preventing any member of the HOA from accessing his property without explicit consent. Local media picked up the story quickly, drawn by the image of a reclusive mountain man being invaded by suburban bureaucrats on a power trip. A local news segment aired footage of the damaged gate and Karen dodging reporters in her driveway, sunglasses on, lips pursed like a deflated balloon. Karen retaliated the only way she knew how, poorly. She held an emergency HOA meeting and accused Thomas of endangering the greater good, even suggesting that her actions were part of a broader civic duty. But her mask slipped when Thomas's legal team released documented evidence of her altering old boundary maps, falsifying a fire corridor that never existed. The forged map had been submitted not only to the HOA board, but also to the county zoning department. That triggered a secondary investigation by county officials. The moment public records became involved, Karen's situation moved from civil dispute to potential criminal fraud. One of her own board members turned whistleblower, admitting that Karen had personally ordered the map alterations and had been planning to annex adjacent parcels under the HOA umbrella to increase dues revenue and jurisdiction. When Michelle delivered a copy of the deposition to Thomas, she grinned. She wanted control? Let's give her a court date instead. The arrest came at dawn, just as the frost began to melt from the pine needles. Thomas stood on his porch with a thermos of coffee in hand, watching the convoy snake its way up the winding HOA-managed road below. 3 unmarked SUVs, 1 county sheriff's cruiser, and behind them, a vehicle bearing the seal of the district attorney's office. It was time. At the heart of Pine Ridge, the HOA clubhouse stood like a smug little fortress, an overbuilt community center surrounded by manicured hedges and brick walkways. It was there, in the middle of a hastily arranged emergency board meeting, that Karen Lawrence was taken into custody. The sheriff entered with calm authority, read the charges aloud: fraudulent misrepresentation, criminal trespassing, willful destruction of private property, and abuse of public emergency systems. When he mentioned attempted unlawful expansion of HOA jurisdiction, a gasp rippled through the dozen stunned board members. Karen didn't go quietly. She shouted about community duty, tried to blame her assistant, claimed political sabotage. But it didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails, altered zoning maps, testimonies from her own board. Even the forged 1993 fire corridor map she had personally submitted to the county. By noon, her mugshot was circulating online. Local news headlines read like something out of a satire column. HOA president arrested in land grab scandal. HOA forums lit up with confusion and fury. Residents who had once boasted about Pine Ridge standards were now deleting social media accounts and pretending they'd never voted for her. But the fall of Karen was only part of the reckoning. The lawsuit proceeded swiftly, and the court ruled decisively in Thomas' favor. The judge didn't mince words. This was not an accident. This was a coordinated attempt to seize control of private property through deception and coercion. In addition to the restraining order, Thomas was awarded $175,000 in damages, enough to rebuild his gate in titanium if he wanted, and the HOA was hit with an injunction prohibiting any future attempts to expand jurisdiction without unanimous documented consent from property owners. Worse for the HOA, the county issued a cease and desist order suspending all Pine Ridge operations until an independent audit could be completed. HOA accounts were frozen. The board was dissolved. Control was handed over to a temporary trustee, who later told a reporter, "What we found inside was more akin to a corrupt mini-government than a neighborhood organization." As for Thomas, he made no victory speech, no press statements. He didn't need to. His land was quiet again. The only sound in the days that followed was the rustling of trees, the distant call of hawks, and the rhythmic tapping of his hammer as he rebuilt the gate, stronger, reinforced, and sealed, with a sign that read in clean, bold lettering, "Private property, not affiliated with Pine Ridge HOA." Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it arrived, it did so with the kind of quiet flourish Thomas appreciated. Melting snow revealing patches of green beneath the pines, wildflowers peeking through sun-warmed soil, and the familiar calls of songbirds returning to the highlands. For the first time in months, his mornings were peaceful again. Not the tense, suspicious kind of quiet that follows conflict, but something real, earned, whole. The new gate stood firm at the head of the gravel drive, its reinforced steel frame anchored in concrete, its hinges smooth and silent. The hand-painted sign above it read the same as before: "Private property, not affiliated with Pine Ridge HOA," but now it carried a weight far beyond ink. It was a line in the sand. Not just for Karen or her defunct HOA, but for anyone who thought power gave them permission to bully their way through someone else's life. Thomas had declined further interviews after the verdict, choosing instead to post a short video on his own terms. In it, he stood beside the new gate, a cup of coffee in hand, and simply said, "Sometimes protecting your peace means standing alone. Just make sure you stand firm." The video went viral. Thousands of comments flooded in, some incredulous, others cheering. Messages from people across the country poured into his inbox. Homeowners facing petty HOA battles, veterans, off-grid builders, even retired law enforcement thanking him for holding the line. He answered a few messages, ignored the noise, and kept to his mountain. He wasn't interested in fame. All he wanted was what he had fought for: quiet, freedom, and the ability to live on his land without interference. Ironically, his relationship with the Pine Ridge residents began to shift. With the old board dismantled and the audit complete, many discovered how far Karen's corruption had reached. Fees had been inflated. Fines had been fabricated. Property modifications had been denied arbitrarily. Several residents formed a new coalition. One focused on voluntary participation and transparency, not control. A few even visited Thomas, cautiously at first, offering handshakes and apologies. One man, a former board member who had resigned before the scandal broke, brought over a bottle of bourbon, You didn't just protect your land, he told Thomas. You cracked the foundation they were standing on. A lot of us owe you for that. Thomas didn't seek praise, but he accepted the gesture. He shared a drink with the man on the porch as dusk fell, both watching the sun sink behind the trees in companionable silence. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. A letter arrived, handwritten, postmarked from a county detention center. Karen's scrawl was unmistakable. I was wrong about the map, about the land, about you. I thought I was protecting a community, but I was trying to control it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to say it. You were right. Thomas read the letter once, then again. He folded it carefully, placed it in a drawer, and said nothing. Some bridges didn't need to be rebuilt, but sometimes, just knowing they were acknowledged was enough. As summer approached, Thomas opened the back cabin for guests. Friends from Denver, former colleagues, even a couple of veterans he'd connected with online. They sat by the fire pit under the stars, drank too much whiskey, and told stories about life, liberty, and the strange things people did when they forgot what those words meant. And through it all, the mountain stood, quiet, unbothered, and finally, fully his.